So, we've been, Daniel's giving the Devar Torah in the Museum Minion tomorrow. So that's what we were sharing. He was
Okay.
sharing.
Sorry about that, guys. I was on a roll.
No, it was very interesting.
Well, as I see it, I have no problem with Abraham marrying his half sister, because at the time it was not forbidden.
Well, there you are. See, if there's no law, there's all sorts of stuff you can do.
And Del, you missed the first part of what I was saying, is that there's things like that all through Genesis that are presented when we read them not as bad or good. They just sort of happen. Like when Lot, there's a great one, I think, the best one, when Lot has the two angels in his house, or the two men in his house, however you want to see that. He basically says, oh, well, the crowd wants to really appease these people, so I'm going to give them my daughters. Well, that kind of, it's like, that's pretty shocking to us. But the same thing, just like you just said, it doesn't appear, if you just read the text, as something that that if there's nothing right or wrong with it. It's almost an amoral act. That's what he did.
But the thing is, you can't, there's who's to judge what is moral or amoral, because the standards that were in play at that time were very different than the morality that's now and the morality as we learned it from Sinai.
Yes.
That's exactly correct, Barbara. And my point is not so much that it's right or wrong back then, but the people didn't have law, period. All they had was the Noahide laws to run their lives.
If they had that.
They were amoral. They didn't have a sense of morality, period.
Right. And so the thing that I would add to this is Judaism's gift to the world. Judaism passed on the moral law from God. That is what makes a difference.
Don't you have a theory about anti-Semitism that's tied with that idea?
Well, yeah, you've heard me talk about that, but and so have you, Dylan, Barbara. But it's by way of saying that some people really don't appreciate the moral law, don't like it very much, would prefer to ignore it. Well, you can't be angry at God. I mean, that really you can be, but was is the chokhmah? What good does that do? Right? So take it out on the messenger. That's my, the theory of anti-Semitism that I absorbed.
Well, with Lot and his two daughters offering
Dale, speak up just a little bit because I'm having trouble hearing you.
With Lot offering up his two daughters to the crowd, there's a tradition that extends, I would say, up until now even, that somebody in my home I am responsible for their well-being.
Right.
And so, if you are a guest in my house and there's people out there demanding that I send you out, well, I'm sorry, we're going to war.
Yeah.
So it seems okay to me to say you're going to war. I'm not sure if it's okay. Here, take my daughters instead.
And there was a case, I think it was with one of the prophets, that similar situation to what Lot was in, only it was, I want to say, the handmaid, and the handmaid was given to the crowd and they raped her to death.
I think isn't that in the book of Judges? Been a while since I went through some of that really happy story stuff. So, well,
here we are.
Yeah, on that interesting note, let's take a look at the meaning of Mount Moriah or Moriah, right? As Moriah is not mentioned in the Bible, other than this, until you get to all the way to the end, to the book of Chronicles, right? As then Solomon began to build the house of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, right? So that's one heck of a place, right? You have the Akedah and the temple on the same location. What connection could there be between those two things?
Well, Mount Moriah was the place of perhaps a miracle and a test of faith and test of belief. And the temple was the, if you want to use the term citadel, or to the belief of the Jewish people. And it was on Mount Moriah that was where the sacrifices of the animals occurred.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So interestingly, you are touching on both of the answers that apply here. One answer essentially is that they are both places where God is encountered. Right? In fact, as you'll see here, one of the potential meanings of Moriah is roeh, seeing, right? And in fact, there are many texts which suggest that the temple is sort of where people went to see God. I know, you and I, all of us in this room, know that we can't see God. They didn't know that back then. They went to the temple and saw God, right? The other answer, which you also allude to, is the answer of sacrifice. Both, the sacrifice ultimately of the ram, thank God, and the sacrifices that are brought by the Kohanim, right? So that's what connects those two events, right? So, what does Moriah mean? One answer, and I just sort of, blew these out from, the Midrash without telling you that each one is from the same Midrash. One says it alludes to the service of the temple. Har HaMoriah is the incense brought there had in it myrrh. Okay? That's why it's Har HaMoriah, because that's where they brought the spices, the incense, etc. Okay? That's one answer. Okay. Next answer, it says it alludes to the word roeh. And roeh is one of the most, is this word that we see time after time after time in the the story of the Akedah. Right? So it's the place of vision, the place I will show you. Right? So, and it's interesting because, Daniel, you were talking about the way it was back then and how hard it is for us to imagine that today, right? So the same thing is true with both of these things, both the sacrifice of Abraham's son by the father and the temple service, right? How did Abraham understand what was going on? We don't know. it's so hard to imagine, particularly, after all the promises that were made to Abraham about the future of his son, his many descendants, etc. And, how does he reconcile that as a person of faith with what he's being asked to do? And it's so hard to imagine, to put oneself into the mind of Abraham and figure out what he was really thinking. And the same thing is true for sacrifices in ancient times. I mean, we know the laws, and we know that, why people brought, the Torah talks about what sacrifices were brought for this thing or that thing. But the mindset, that's something else. Yeah, Daniel, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, no, I was unmuting. I was on another screen. So the way I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, and I mean that sincerely. So God promised that the Jewish people would come from descendants of Isaac. That's a promise that God made. He also then tells Abraham, sacrifice Isaac. So if Abraham's smart with logic, he's going to say either the promise is wrong or something's going to happen and Isaac is going to live. I'm not going to sacrifice him. So whatever I do is going to be okay. So the test.
But do you really believe that?
Well, but the test, when you put it in those terms, is not about faith. It's about reason. In other words, his logic is Isaac isn't going to die because that promise would have been wrong. It's a matter of you can't have your cake and eat it too. These two premises can't be both accurate. It strikes me as more of a test of reason than it is of faith.
Well, in the discussion of the Akedah, if I recall, Isaac said, we've got the knife, we've got the wood, and we're missing the sacrifice. And Abraham responds to him by saying, God will provide the sacrifice. So at that point, Abraham obviously has faith that God is going to give him something to sacrifice other than his son.
Or at least that's what he's telling his son.
Exactly. And it may be that he's trying to convince himself as well.
That's true. Could be.
Maybe. And maybe that is what Abraham is thinking.
Abraham had argued with God pertaining to Sodom and Gomorrah. Why didn't Abraham argue with God about his own son?
Yes, that is a fine question, Del. And I don't find satisfactory answers to that in the commentaries. I just, it may be that what Daniel is suggesting is the answer, that Abraham is willing to go without questioning, because deep down he knows that it's not going to happen that way, because God's already made this promise. I say that with a capital M, maybe, because I'm really not sure.
There's another, and I don't want to get sidetracked here, but there's another story within this Parsha Vayera in which Sarah, the first time she's just jealous of Hagar, and she wants them to be Ishmael and Hagar to be banished into the desert. And it very clearly says this did not make Abraham happy. He did not like this idea.
Yeah.
But he doesn't do anything to argue with his wife, Sarah, over this, what to us is a very unjust act. It was Sarah's idea for Hagar to be with her husband. So why would Abraham argue with God over Sodom and Gomorrah, but not argue with his wife about something like this that's so personal?
Abraham didn't have to sleep with God.
Okay, I'm glad you said that, Della, not me. Okay, I'll stop laughing. But anyway, the point being is that Abraham was a very inconsistently, when he acted for justice and when he didn't, it's like almost random.
Well,
but it's not random. I mean, the Akedah and the the peace with Sarah is different because God tells Abraham, Shema b'kolah, listen to her voice. Okay? So that I can sort of understand. God is telling Abraham it's all going to work out. As far as the Akedah is concerned, Daniel, maybe you're right, but it's a big maybe. Okay? Hello, Ann. Okay, so let me go back to the share screen here. And here's the third answer about Moriah. Right? It says Moriah alludes to the teaching, Hora'ah, of Torah, and may be a feminine form of the word Moreh, teacher. So Hara Moriah is the place from which teaching issued forth to the world. Okay, so there's a third answer about the meaning of Moriah. Ultimately, this is the place which sends forth Torah.
Thus, the temple being built on the place which sends forth Torah, which sends forth learning, is appropriate.
Yeah, although, in antiquity, it was much more about ritual than it was about the teaching of Torah. But of course, if you're talking about a later age where there are sages and there's a Sanhedrin and there's judgment that is based on Torah, so then it makes sense. Okay. So let me just skip down to this piece from Heschel, right, who writes about Jerusalem. So he says, why was Mount Moriah chosen to be the site on which to build the temple and the Holy of Holies, rather than Mount Sinai on which the Ten Commandments were given? The answer offered is that Mount Moriah was the site where Abraham sacrificed his beloved son, and the sanctity of sacrifice transcends the sanctity of the commandments. Okay?
You believe that?
Well, I am not one to argue with Heschel very often, right?
It's a matter of
but you have to read the next paragraph, right? Where he continues, and he says, infinitely greater than the sacrifice of Isaac was the martyrdom of the camps. The state of Israel was built on that martyrdom. Its people are, to use the phrase from Zechariah, ud mutzal me'esh, a brand plucked from the fire. Right? So Heschel's answer, but he gives it a very startling twist. And he says, this is the sacrifice on which the state of Israel was built.
Rabbi,
Yes, Del.
Mount Moriah is within the bounds of the promised land.
I'm sorry, what?
Mount Moriah is within the boundaries of the promised land.
Yes.
Sinai is not.
I'm sorry?
Mount Sinai is not.
Well,
Very
yes.
important.
Right. But theoretically, you know, Sinai could have been a central shrine for Judaism.
Instead, we don't know where it is.
Well, we sort of know where it is.
Don't know
But-
which mountain.
The, the correct answer is that there's a nice stream of water underneath the ground in Jerusalem, and it makes a much better site to build the Holy Temple, whereas Mount Sinai is in the middle of a desert.
Oh,
So
what a practical answer, Daniel.
Yes, but there is a stream of water under the mountain that is so called Mount Sinai. Of course, we don't know if it's the same Mount Sinai. The one that has a monastery halfway up the top. There's a wonderful
Yeah.
stream of water, and it's the most delicious water you ever had in your life.
But it's not within our promised.
I don't know
territory.
because I've never had that one.
So, Rabbi, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I don't understand or if it just doesn't sit well to me to say that Israel, the state of Israel, was not only plucked from the fire of these camps, but that it's almost like a causal statement. If it weren't for the camps, there would be no state of Israel. And I've always rejected that.
Yeah, I do too. I think Heschel is saying something different. Heschel would not, to my knowledge, say that the Holocaust had to happen in order to have the state of Israel. What he's saying is that it is, you know, to a great extent, the survivors out of whom the state was built.
And Isaac was also a survivor. Is there something like that?
And Isaac is too a survivor, yes. But that's not his point.
But I mean, that's where he gets into trouble, Rabbi. Isaac was saved by God himself or an angel on the behalf of God.
And who
But-
was saved in 1944?
I'm sorry?
And who was saved in the 1940s?
The descendants of Isaac. Because
Well,
the
I
Jewish
don't,
people were the descendants, came from the descendants of Isaac.
the Jewish people were saved after 1945 by the 800,000 Jews that were already in Israel putting their life on the line. I'm not sure if there was divine intervention.
Yeah, I think it was 800,000 after people, once they started
Whatever,
out.
the Jewish people,
Hey,
the
but
Jewish
yeah,
people
yeah.
saved ourselves.
Yeah, however, you know, you have to remember that a lot of those people came to Israel out of communities that were persecuted in Eastern Europe and, for that matter, in the Arab world.
That they formed an army.
All I'm trying to say is that God saved Isaac, and I don't know whether it's, and if Heschel is trying to say, and in the same way God saved the Jewish people in 1945.
So I believe that is not what Heschel is saying.
Okay, I'm with you. I understand that I'm probably misreading it, but that's what it sounds like to me.
No, I think he would, if he were saying that, he would have said that the martyrdom of Auschwitz had to happen in order for the state of Israel and all of its glory to come into existence.
But if that's not what he's saying, what is he saying?
What is he saying? He's saying that it is the survivors to a large extent who made the state survive.
But is he aligning that with the experience of Isaac? Because what he's saying, it's almost like as God saved Isaac, God saved Israel. And the reality is that Isaac didn't save himself, nor did
I don't think
God
he's
save
saying that God saved the remnant. I think he's saying that out of the remnant comes something that those people create, just as Isaac and his descendants create something great. Heschel does not theologize particularly about the Holocaust. His response to the Holocaust was not a book of theology. It was a book about the culture of Eastern European Jewry that was destroyed by the Nazis. That was actually it was one of his first books in English. It's called The Earth is the Lord's.
Boy, the next quote in here is even more disturbing.
Well, since you're looking ahead, let's all look ahead at that. Okay. So here's a Hasidic teaching: the place where a Jew stretched forth his neck in order to be sacrificed is holier than the place where the Torah was given. There, where the Torah was given, the divine presence appears. There, as it were, Torah is given once again.
Okay. Wait a minute.
And you are troubled by that, Daniel?
I don't like the line where a Jew stretched forth his neck in order to be sacrificed.
That's Isaac.
But that's not the way it happened, even close.
Yeah. I don't like
But
it either.
Isaac submits himself willingly.
He didn't know what was going on.
He knew.
His father lied to him.
No, it didn't. He told him the truth.
He's old enough to be coherent. And probably old enough to be traumatized by this.
And at the time, Isaac was what, about 13 years old?
36.
Not clear.
Okay.
One answer is he was like 3 years old.
And
another answer is
39.
He's 39. But if you look at the language he uses in speaking to his father in this story.
The lad.
What, Ann?
The lad.
The lad, yes. But even the language that he uses, not just the language that is used about him, it seems to me that he is a youngster. Old enough to know what's going on once he's actually bound on the altar, but not old enough to where he was going to go question his dad when his dad said, okay, let's get up and go, and we're taking a camping trip.
But he didn't say they're taking a camping trip.
Not
more
exactly,
or less.
no.
All right. So the place where a Jew stretched forth his neck is saying that
Isaac allowed himself to be sacrificed.
Not only that, he was a great person for doing so. I mean, I don't know. It doesn't seem like a very Jewish concept to me.
You don't like the idea that he would have been willing to be sacrificed.
I guess not, no.
Uh-huh.
But that's the doctrine.
How do you all feel about that?
But it could also refer not necessarily to the binding of Isaac, but perhaps refers to the martyrdom of the sages. And that the sages standing forth and going to, like Akiba for the sake of the teaching of the Torah, honors the sanctity of the Torah.
Yeah, theoretically, Barbara, that could be, but I think in this particular Vort, in this little Dvar Torah, he is talking about Moriah. And if you're talking about Moriah and human, a person sacrificing himself, you're talking about Isaac. That's my sense of it.
But I've always, from earliest childhood until now, hated that story.
I can't imagine why. Why? Let me tell you something. They didn't teach us this story in Aleph class, and there's a reason.
Oh, but they taught it to us in kindergarten.
In kindergarten?
Yes.
Well,
they said that the reason that he taught that the Bible has this story was to teach us not to engage in human sacrifice. That was the lesson of the story.
Right. But just think of, you're a kindergarten child and you are reading about how, a father was ready to kill his only son.
Yeah. And I was horrified. I thought maybe my father would do the same.
Absolutely so. Yeah. That's why we don't teach this to kindergartners.
Maybe somebody doesn't, but it's in my kindergarten book. I
understand. Maybe they just didn't understand about traumatizing children when you were in kindergarten. But I remember in first grade, and this is 1957, we were doing drills, because people were thinking, well, there's going to be a nuclear war. Like that drill would have made any difference.
Yeah, hide under your desk. Right. That's a big help. I remember that too.
Yeah.
I mean, any child knows that that's not going to help.
Well, no, I didn't know that in first grade. I didn't know what nuclear war meant.
They showed us movies of what happens in a nuclear war, and then they told us to hide under our desk.
Movie. And I'm glad.
I'm glad.
I would still be having nightmares if they had.
Okay, I have a question.
Please, Daniel, let's get us away from mushroom clouds.
What? I'm sorry. We all think of this story as being a test of faith. What if that whole interpretation is just completely wrong? Maybe, but what third story can we tell about what's going on here that is not a test of faith? Where do we get the idea that that's what this is? Does it say in the Torah God tested Abraham? I guess
yes, that's the outset of the story.
All right.
Elohim nisa et Abraham.
Is there any implication to that? What was being tested? Did it say faith was being tested?
Well, most commentators do assume that the test is, will he be willing to sacrifice his son, even though he's been promised, generations of descendants. But it has been suggested that, in fact, the test was whether Abraham would say no.
I like that answer, that explanation a lot more.
I like it better, but I don't think it's what was going on in the text.
Well, yeah, and therein lies the problem. Sometimes what's actually going on in the text is not so appealing to us. Sort of like the story that Daniel was telling before about Lot's daughters. There's two of those stories that are not so terrific, by the way, right?
Two stories about Lot's daughters?
Yeah.
So also back to what I was saying an hour ago. The key to what you're saying though is that the rabbis interpreted, and what I'm trying to do is separate what the rabbis interpreted based on their understanding of the law that was given way after all these events happened,
Right.
with what the text actually says. And every time we get into this discussion every year of tests of faith, we end up at a dead end.
Well, it does not specifically say that to pass the test meant to be willing to sacrifice his son. So
I
you
got another
have that
version.
little crack in the door to be able to make the case that Abraham actually failed the test. Yeah, Dale,
Yeah, I can
you were trying to
imagine.
say something?
No,
I got a different way to look at the test. All the
Okay.
other people in the whole community, the Canaanites, were sacrificing their children. Maybe that's true. It's very, very possible. Okay, so they were pressuring Abraham. How come you're not sacrificing your kid? And so Abraham says, okay, fine. He says, Sarah, get out the angel outfit.
I have a very science fiction midrash, and that is that God had actually gone to hundreds, thousands, millions of other men before Abraham. And in every last one of them, Isaac was sacrificed. The son was sacrificed, which made it not even worth writing about because nothing ever happened. The Jewish people never existed. Abraham was the first one who stopped himself from doing it. It wasn't an angel that had nothing to do it. He, at the very end, refused it. And he was the very first one who did that. That makes Abraham a hero that is somebody that we could look up to as descendants of.
So that, I mean, to me, it is a plausible interpretation of the story. I would venture to say that until modern times, no one seriously offered that interpretation. But I could be wrong.
Well, that's
I
what I'm
really
trying to
don't
say,
have an
essentially,
answer.
Rabbi, is that these explanations that we've been hearing for however many hundreds of years, they don't ever go anywhere.
They're awful.
Well, it makes me think of when we had the scholar in, Richard Elliott Friedman, on who wrote the Bible. Like,
Yes.
why was this story put in here, and from which group did this story come from? So I just started reading his book, so we haven't gotten to that part yet. But I find as we come to these more troubling stories is who decided this was Bible worthy? Like, where did the people coming from who wrote this per se, and how this got put in, like what was the thought process, what had been passed down with the stories, and how did it make the cut?
It's interesting. I have here on my desk Friedman's commentary on the Bible.
Of course you do.
Well,
Do you have the one with the multiple
you say
colors?
of course, but it wasn't always on my desk. It just happens to be right now.
Are you reading that right now, Ashley?
No. Hey, your question is to Ashley.
It's on my nightstand. That's what I've been reading lately.
Good for you.
And are you reading the one with the multiple colors telling exactly what source each thing came from?
No, it's just his book, and then we'll see where we go from there. I've got Jennifer Teague's book to read also before she comes in next week.
Jennifer who?
Teague. My grandfather would have shot me. She's our scholar that's coming in next week.
I'm dying to hear from her. That is
So-
such a provocative
one other
article.
thing about, well, one thing in Friedman's commentary, it's not really related to this, but it's interesting. It says there are two ways you can read Abraham's response to Isaac's question, right? Isaac says, here are the fire and the wood, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering? So one answer is God will see to the sheep for the burnt offering, my son, or God will see to the sheep for the burnt offering, my son. Hear
Oh,
the
dear.
difference?
Yeah, one's got a comma and the other doesn't.
It's got a colon.
Commas are very important sometimes.
Yeah.
So if you got a colon
Subtly
there,
conveying that it's you.
and
Yeah.
Isaac is supposedly understood, to have understood. He understood what was happening and he walked on with his father anyway.
Yeah.
He didn't run away.
Now, here's one other thing that lends itself to the suggestion that Abraham actually passes the test, right? Because at the end of the story, it says, "Now I know that you fear God and you didn't withhold your son, your only one, from me." Right? And it's then that he sees the ram. Now, those are the words that are put in the mouth of the angel. All right. But who wrote this anyway? There were two people there. And just one more interesting thing, and then we're gonna quit for the night. At the end of the story, the angel blesses Abraham, and then it says, Vayeshev Avraham el Na'arav. Abraham went back to the youths.
And
Remember
where
the
did
youths that
Isaac
they
go?
left behind earlier on the mountain, right? And they got up and went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived in Beersheba, right? It doesn't say that Isaac went back with him.
Because Isaac had been sacrificed.
Either in one form of the story, Abraham actually sacrifices Isaac, but this text obviously says, no, that's not the way it was. And so, it's very powerful. They don't go back together. And after the Akedah, they never speak to each other again.
You
And
wouldn't
his
either.
wife dies.
And Sarah dies. One midrash says it's like from the shock of hearing what happened. Well, I didn't figure that we would solve any of the problems with this, and we didn't. But we definitely hit on the problems and enlivened them just a little bit. So thank you all for coming tonight, and we'll pick up with the saga of Isaac and Rebecca next week.
We'll see you.
Yeah,
Good night,
Shabbat
everybody.
Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank
Good
you,
luck on
Rabbi.
Saturday,
Shalom.
Daniel.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everybody.
Ashley.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Ashley.
Thank you.